Time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Al, as you might have guessed, the topic today is Joe Biden and his presidency after the fall of Kabul last Sunday. There are so many angles to this very sad story, but at its core, it seems to me, and I suspect for other Americans, is whether or not Joe Biden is competent to remain president. And secondly, if this Afghanistan failure is a terminal one for him politically and his agenda, even if you're, in your opinion, he is competent to stay in office.
Well, Dave, first of all, I mean, Afghanistan is such a tough issue because there's so many emotions involved. Families who have lost loved ones in Afghanistan. We've made a 20-year investment in a policy that obviously has not succeeded. But your question is the right one, and my answer is yes. Joe Biden is competent to be president. Obviously, the scenes of chaos at the Kabul airport have been unnerving and very tragic. And there's no doubt that President Biden, because of all this happened on his watch, bears ultimate responsibility for what's happened. But I don't think, to be honest with you, I don't think his basic competency to be president is in question. Now, I've been trying to figure out how to address this Afghanistan issue from the perspective of your question. And I guess I divide it into two questions. First, did President Biden make the right decision to withdraw and end the war? And second, how did his administration execute that withdrawal? I think it's clear that Biden has long supported pulling troops from Afghanistan. He argued that when he was vice president. He said he was going to do it in his campaign, and he kept that promise. And if you believe the polls, most Americans think that was the right decision. Now, he's not the first president to have wanted out of Afghanistan. President Obama wanted out, in the sort of the military leadership intelligence community talked him into actually increasing the commitment. President Trump wanted out, and he actually set a deadline that was earlier than the time frame that President Biden actually adopted. And but we all read last weekend, the report in the Washington Post that documented this Afghan policy is really a failure based on lies and false promises, undercut by dysfunction and bureaucratic snarls. That report underscored that the three presidents preceding Joe Biden, Bush, Obama, and Trump, and their military commanders weren't able to deliver on their promises about Afghanistan or prevail in Afghanistan. All that, for some of us who are old enough, is eerily familiar to what happened in Vietnam. And in my mind, made Biden's decision to end the war a correct one. The answer to my second question, however, is not quite so favorable to President Biden. The execution of the withdrawal by the Biden administration and its military commanders has so far been a tragic debacle. And the president needs to own up to that. And I don't think he's done that yet. I mean, he sort of said, I take responsibility, the buck stops here. But then yesterday in an interview with George Stephanopoulos seemed to pull back a little bit. But he needs to do what President Kennedy did after the Bay of Pigs and say, I was responsible. I'm in charge and I'm responsible. Now, he has the responsibility to preside over an orderly withdrawal of not only all Americans, but tens of thousands probably of Afghans who have helped us and whose lives are in danger. I think just watching on television, you have to say the last couple of days, the order at the Kabul airport has improved after the 82nd Airborne arrived. But we have a long way to go, and a successful withdrawal may very well depend on the good graces of the Taliban, and that is not something that is a very appetizing proposition. But most important, what Biden needs to do now, and this is critical, he needs to do everything he can, send whatever resources he needs, if it's more troops, whatever it needs, to ensure that safe withdrawal of the Americans and our Afghan partners. Now, if he does that, in a couple of months from now, we look back on it and say, you know, it was pretty messy, but we got everybody out. The political damage will be mitigated, but the truth is he's still going to pay a political price from those scenes of chaos and dysfunction, and some would say outright incompetence. His poll numbers have dropped. Now we'll have to wait and see whether that's temporary or not, because often they may, you know, in other cases they bounce back in circumstances like this. But for Biden, the most important thing is, one of the main premises of his presidency is competency. He was going to return competency, you know, to the White House, to the government. And as we've discussed over the last several months, he's been off to a pretty good start with vaccinating the country, passing his recovery plan, which was, and then seeing the economy come back. And all that can be undermined by the scenes out of Kabul. And what I would say, if you know, the big part of his agenda now, the $3.5 trillion budget, really is dependent on people believing that government can deliver and trusting in government. And so those scenes don't help. And if COVID continues to get worse, if crime continues to become a big issue, and if inflation does not abate, you know, he's going to have a very hard time getting the rest of his agenda through. And the Democrats could have a very unpleasant mid-year election next year. You know, I think that what President Biden learned this week is the truth of what President Kennedy said after the Bay of Pigs. He said, there's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And I think President Biden is that graphic picture of him over the weekend, sitting alone at that big conference table at Camp David in a teleconference with his military and intelligence advisors. I think it sort of demonstrated he's learned that.
Greg, I want to ask the same question. I mean, can you talk a little bit about your thoughts about his competency?
I thought that Hal's analysis is something around which I largely concur. I think that kind of harsh judgment of Biden right now is not warranted, in part because I think we only know a little bit about what actually happened, and probably much of what we know is not even correct. I think that this was an engagement over 20 years where there were all kinds of miscalculations. We were backing leaders who probably urged us not to suggest it was time to get out so that they could get their families out and their money out before they then fled. And once they fled, in spite of the $86 billion we spent to build up a military, what we couldn't do was create a will among the people of Afghanistan to defend their country, or at least those that we were arming. I think President Biden honestly was faced with a terrible choice, two choices, a terrible choice and a worse choice. Had he taken actions, had the administration taken actions, and the military taken actions that demonstrated we believed the government was near collapse, which I believe the intelligence community knew absolutely was the case, They knew where the money was. They knew where the people were going. They knew the cities were falling because the trained military people were simply walking away and leaving their weapons behind, probably. I think they knew that collapse was a certainty if they signaled that it was time to get out. So then they chose not to send that signal, but to engage in a sort of positive view that there could be time for a peaceful transition. There were talks going on, talks being held. All that was accurate. It's just that I don't believe in the end we're going to find that the hard intelligence believed that much was going to come out of those talks. And so they were buying time. They clearly didn't know how little time they had. I think that's probably accurate. And thus you had chaos at the one place you absolutely have to protect to keep open, besides our embassy, when that's the airport. You have to find a means of providing safe passage to get people out. But they've gotten 5,000 people out as of a day or two ago. That's no small number. They clearly know they've got thousands more to go, but they seem to have the airport under control. You know, Ronald Reagan was once faced with many tough decisions, all presidents are, but he was faced with a tough political decision. And in the cabinet room, one of his advisors, his political advisor, stood up and said, "Mr. President, I'd like to explain the political consequences of the action that's being recommended." And the political advisor gave a pretty good statement of how bad it could be. And the president looked at this fellow and said, well, I appreciate that, but we're actually going to do what's right, and we'll let the politics take care of itself. I was a little more moved than some people actually by Biden's defense of his actions. I think he deeply believes that getting out is the right thing to do. I think he knows, based on experience, and as I say, based on intelligence that we don't have access to, that the consequences would be swift and probably severe for a lot of people. But let's not forget, we've been there 20 years, first chasing Al Qaeda, but this is a very, very violent place. It was governed by warlords. And people either did what the warlord in their area told them to do, or they killed their whole family. We've lost close to 200,000 people, many of whom are Afghan civilians, Afghan fighters, probably a little under 3,000 of Americans, and then countless scores more wounded physically and emotionally. So this is a very violent place. There is no reason to believe that this would have been some kind of a smooth negotiated transition in a hotel in another country where handshakes were exchanged and we all went on about our business. One of the interesting things, and the one element, and I think Al touched upon it, what is going to determine how this is eventually viewed for Biden, unfortunately, is out of his control, and that's what the Taliban do. They're now in charge of a country that is totally different than the one they left some 20 years ago. There's more electricity, there's more internet, there are more people getting education. I heard the other day, 40% of whom are girls. They have a country that is going to be, I think, far less accepting of the kind of country that the Taliban are used to. And how they deal with that, how they choose to govern, is another thing. I also think that other foreign powers are at play here. I noticed that a report that one of the Russian diplomats said that he'd met with the Taliban, and they're good guys. We can work with them. So we have another story here of who's feeding and funding and arming the Taliban. Clearly, we invested billions and couldn't do a sufficient job with the Afghan fighters. But there's a lot at play here, and I think the story will emerge. We're also a long way, frankly, from elections next year, and President Biden's fate in all of this is far from being determined in my mind. I do think it has consequences if you appear to be less effective, less organized than people would want. But again, I'll end where I started. I think it's too soon to be too harsh until we know a little bit more about what they knew and what actually happened on the ground.
I guess I want both of you also to respond to this criticism that with this very small footprint in that country, it was a small kind of insurance policy that would have maintained the status quo rather than this very dramatic withdrawal. What say ye on that, Al?
I think that in the last, I don't know how many months, the Taliban had made gains all over the country. And they can, control from, used to control a small amount of the country, and now we're up to 50%. So even with us there, they were going to continue to grow. Now, I suppose it's possible that if we had kept, I don't know, 2,500 would have been enough, but a small amount of troops there, we might have been able to protect the green zone in Kabul, but that was about it. I mean, this was a policy that continuously failed. I mean, that Post article that was based on, I think they said 400 interviews with the leaders who had served there, was quite damning. And it was only a matter of time until the whole thing was going to collapse. I mean, sometimes you just got to pull the plug. And my guess, I must admit that when it first happened, I thought, maybe if we kept a small footprint there, we'd have some stability. But after reading that, what all the commanders over 20 years have said, I think that just would not have happened. We would have suffered one way or another. And sometimes you just got to cut your losses.
Well, I know I concur with that. I think it's kind of wishful thinking and armchair quarterbacking to suggest that having a few troops there would have made a difference. I think the strength of the U.S. military is best when it shows its overwhelming force and achieves a very specific mission. And leaving a few troops in place when you see the kind of support that we lacked from the fighters we had trained, I think would have just put our people in jeopardy. I thought it was interesting too that the contractors, they knew that the decision had been made, and man, they were getting out of there. They were not going to keep their people in place. And the very article that Al was referring to talks about how in many cases they detested the people they were trying to train because they were untrainable and they were corrupt. So the real decision moment was a few months ago when Biden crossed the threshold of deciding whether to ramp up and put more military in there and engage the Taliban militarily, or to withdraw. Once a decision was made to withdraw, however people might feel about that, I think the kind of conclusion we're seeing was probably inevitable. And it was certainly inevitable that whatever happened, the president would either be credited or blamed with the outcome. And I suspect Biden knows that. And what he does in the weeks and months ahead to lay out a clear plan is, we'll just have to wait and see. It is a defining moment in his presidency, and how he manages through it is something that has challenged all presidents, and something I'm sure we'll be talking about in a future program.
So we will continue this conversation in our outtake section. But for now, Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thanks so much. We'll see you next time.